Before men planted flags on the moon, and before astronauts became national icons with square jaws and good press photos, there was a small Moscow stray with pointed ears and a curled tail who was sent upward alone. Her name was Laika, and she became the first dog in space, the first living creature from Earth to orbit the planet, and one of the saddest symbols of the space age. People remember her now with a mix of wonder and guilt. Wonder because her flight marked a real turning point in history. Guilt because she was never coming back. That is what gives Laika's story its peculiar force. It is a tale of scientific ambition, Cold War theater, public sentiment, and sacrifice. It has triumph in it, though also a moral bruise that never quite fades. The space age did not begin with clean heroism. It began with rockets, rivalry, improvisation, propaganda, and a little dog who paid the bill. Laika was not born famous. She was not bred as some noble state hound with a groomed pedigree and a brass nameplate. She was a stray picked up from the streets of Moscow. The Soviet program preferred strays for practical reasons. They were thought to be tougher, better able to endure hunger, cold, discomfort, and confinement. It is a grimly revealing detail. The first animals chosen for these missions were not pampered creatures drawn from comfort. They were little survivors from a hard city, selected precisely because hardship had already shaped them. The Soviets eventually narrowed their candidates to a few small female dogs. Smaller animals fit the capsule more easily, and females were considered easier to manage in the cramped conditions of flight. Laika, along with other dogs such as Albina and Mushka, became part of this strange early corps of canine cosmonauts. They were trained through confinement, vibration tests, centrifuge runs, noise exposure, and repeated adjustments to tight spaces and artificial feeding systems. It sounds clinical when written that way. In practice, it meant a frightened animal being taught to endure the machinery of an age racing ahead of its own conscience. And that age was racing fast. Sputnik 1 had already stunned the world in October 1957. The Soviet Union had beaten the United States into orbit, and the shock was immense. Americans heard that metallic beep from the sky, and felt, for the first time in a very public way, that the heavens might no longer belong to them. The Soviet leadership wanted another victory quickly. Nikita Khrushchev wanted a dramatic follow-up timed near the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. The result was Sputnik 2, a far more ambitious mission designed and assembled under intense time pressure. That haste matters because it explains nearly everything tragic about Laika's mission. Sputnik 2 was not a leisurely piece of careful engineering polished over years. It was built in a rush, with political urgency riding on top of technical ambition. The Soviet Union wanted another spectacular win in the propaganda war, and fast. There was no time to develop a safe recovery system for the animal passenger. The designers knew that. The officials knew that. Laika was sent up on a one-way trip from the beginning. That fact was concealed, of course. Publicly, Soviet statements suggested that the dog would be monitored, cared for, perhaps even euthanized painlessly before oxygen ran out. The reality was uglier and more chaotic. For years, the official story drifted around a false calm, as though Laika had survived peacefully for days in orbit before dying in a managed and almost dignified way. Only much later did fuller accounts emerge. She likely died within hours of launch from overheating and stress after a failure in the thermal control system. So even the old story of the noble slow death in space was, in a sense, a softer fiction laid over a harsher truth. That makes Laika's flight one of those episodes where science, statecraft, and sentiment collide in a distinctly modern way. The mission was real, the achievement was real. A living creature from Earth had entered orbit for the first time. Biomedical data was gathered. Engineers learned things about life support systems, launch stress, and the basic possibility of keeping an organism alive during part of orbital flight. Those lessons helped point the way toward later human missions. None of that is fake, yet it is equally true that the mission was built on deception and sacrifice. The little dog did not consent to becoming a martyr for Soviet prestige. She was strapped into history because the state had urgent symbolic needs. There is something almost unbearable in that contrast. On one side, the vast grandeur of the space age opening above the Earth. On the other, a small frightened animal alone in a metal sphere, panting as the temperature rose. People often speak of the early space race as though it were pure romance. Rockets rising, brave pioneers, national destiny, the clean thrill of human advancement. That is not false, though it is incomplete. The early years were also full of rough edges, dangerous improvisations, and a willingness to accept casualties in the name of speed. Laika's mission reveals that truth with painful clarity. Before spaceflight became an orderly pageant of carefully branded heroism, it was a contest in which states were willing to take terrible risks for symbolic advantage. The stars did not soften politics. They gave politics a new stage. Still, the public response to Laika was not simple. Many people admired the achievement. Many were moved by the image of a dog circling the Earth. Children especially responded to her with immediate emotional force. A dog is not an abstract payload. A dog has a face. A dog has an expression. A dog invites attachment whether governments want that or not. That became a problem for the Soviet narrative. It is easier to boast about a rocket than a doomed animal with a name. Laika became famous precisely because she was both symbol and creature. She could stand for Soviet technological daring, though she also stirred pity. Newspapers around the world ran her image. Animal welfare groups protested. Letters were sent. Some people admired the science while recoiling from the cost. Others condemned the mission outright. Suddenly, the space race had a moral witness, and it had 4 legs. This is part of what makes Laika's legacy so enduring. She forced ordinary people to feel the human meaning of an inhuman contest. Sputnik 1 had been a technical shock. Laika made the race emotional. She brought the space age down from geopolitical abstraction into the realm of ordinary feeling. People could argue about missiles, orbits, and ideology in a detached way. It was harder to detach from a dog. The Soviet state, being what it was, tried to manage that symbolism. Laika was celebrated in posters, stamps, and children's stories. She was turned into an emblem of communist scientific advance, cheerful and brave in official imagery. That is one of the strangest habits of modern regimes. They take victims, dress them in optimism, and ask the public to applaud the costume. Yet propaganda can never fully control what a symbol means. Laika slipped the leash of official messaging almost immediately. She became, in time, less a symbol of Soviet glory than of the strange moral price of the age. And what an age it was. The 1950s were full of technological confidence and apocalyptic fear. Nuclear weapons existed. Missiles existed. Empires were fraying. Modern consumer life was expanding. Science carried both promise and threat in every direction. In that atmosphere, a dog in orbit felt like a message from the future, though the future had not yet decided whether it was benevolent. Laika's flight seemed to prove that barriers were falling fast. The sky was open now. Earth was no longer a sealed human world. If a dog could go to space, then perhaps a man would soon follow. If a man could follow, then perhaps anything was possible. That was the dazzling side of it. The darker side was that anything is possible includes things that ought not to be done. Modernity often runs into that problem headfirst. It becomes very excited about what can be achieved, and rather evasive about what ought to be attempted. Laika sits right at that crossroads. Her mission was possible. It was scientifically useful in a limited but real way. It was politically potent. It was also cruel. Those facts do not cancel one another out. They sit together in tension, which is why the story still bites. It also shaped later space ethics. Laika's death became part of the reason later animal flights were watched more closely and judged more severely. The Soviets themselves continued to use dogs in testing, though eventually Belka and Strelka, flown in 1960, returned alive and became global celebrities. That mattered. It showed that survival and recovery were possible. The age of sending animals blindly upward to die for prestige could not remain morally invisible forever. Laika's sacrifice, unwilling though it was, helped expose the need for different standards. History learns this way, by wounding something lovable and then calling the scar a lesson. There is also a broader historical irony here. Laika never knew it. obviously, though her mission contributed to a path that led toward human spaceflight and, eventually, toward a less brutal understanding of life in space. The medical monitoring from her flight and from other early animal missions helped engineers and scientists refine their expectations about launch stress and biological response. In that narrow technical sense, she helped make Yuri Gagarin possible. She also helped make later American animal flights and later manned missions, part of a more developed field rather than pure speculation. The dog from Moscow became one of the first unwilling travelers on the road to human space exploration, and that gives the story its painful grandeur. Laika was not merely a victim, she became part of one of the great turning points in human history. The first orbit of a living creature was no small thing. One can condemn the mission's cruelty and still recognize its place in the larger arc of exploration. In fact, one should do both. Sanitizing the science into pure heroism is dishonest. Reducing it to pure cruelty is also too simple. History is often built from mixed things, noble ambitions tied to ugly methods, real breakthroughs purchased at costs later generations can barely justify to themselves. Laika's flight belongs to that class of event. It lifted human possibility and stained it at the same time. That may be why artists, writers, and musicians keep returning to her. Laika has inspired songs, poems, novels, documentaries, memorials, and children's books. Some portray her as innocent sacrifice, some as symbol of Soviet ambition, some as a lonely little soul in the machinery of the 20th century. She lends herself to art because the story is already shaped like tragedy. Small life, vast ambition, no return. The contrast does half the work before the writer even begins. And then there is memory. In Moscow, there is now a monument to Laika, unveiled in 2008, decades after her death, and long after the Soviet Union itself had vanished. That monument says something useful about how history works. The state that sent her upward in haste and concealment is gone. The little dog remains, empires boast, symbols shift, official stories decay, yet sometimes the most enduring figure is the one least able to defend herself. There is justice in that, of a sort. The people who planned the mission have largely faded into specialist history. Laika is still remembered by name. That name matters. Had she remained only the dog or the biological payload, the story would have dulled into technical history. But Laika was named, and names do something to the conscience. A named creature is harder to reduce to function. That is one reason the story still reaches ordinary people. It is not about a generic test subject. It is about Laika, a particular dog, a face, a body, a fate. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson hidden inside the tale. Modern civilization is very good at abstraction. It can speak of systems, races, programs, goals, trajectories, and strategic necessity in a cool, steady voice, while some small, vulnerable thing bears the cost. Laika cuts through that abstraction. She reminds us that behind every grand project, there are lives pressed into service, some human, some animal, some visible, some hidden. Progress is real, discovery is real, ambition can be magnificent. Yet, if a civilization wishes to remain civilized, it must learn to ask what its triumphs require of the weak. The space age was born with that question already waiting. So yes, Laika was the first dog in space. She was the first living creature from Earth to orbit the planet. She became part of one of the most dramatic technological contests in history. She helped open the road to spaceflight. She also died alone because a superpower wanted a faster headline. The story is glorious and terrible in the same breath. That is why it endures. The stars did not receive her gently. History did. Watch the next video because Laika's story is not only about the first space race. It is about what ambition costs, what symbols can do, and how even the smallest life can haunt the grandest machinery of an age. She also died alone because a superpower wanted a faster headline. The story is glorious and terrible in the same breath. The stars did not receive her gently. History did. Watch the next video because Laika's story is not only about space. It is about what ambition costs, what symbols can do, and how even the smallest life can haunt an age. This has been Elwyn with Elenarda. End transmission.